Oh, you haven't?
Now go. Now go.
Okay, great. Hello, and welcome to the Public Bank Solution television program. It's the first one that we're doing, and we are delighted to have your attendance and to take a look at something entirely new that's emerging around America in terms of creating a new type of banking institution that's dedicated to the public interest. The opening video that we played for you just now gives you a sense of the kind of work that's underway and the issues that we're addressing with the public bank solution. The public banks have been around literally for hundreds of years, and they're in use for a very large portion of the global asset management. But here in America, not so much. In fact, here in America, almost not at all, except for one bank, which is the Bank of North Dakota, now almost 100 years old, and an outlier in terms of bank performance, of efficiency, effectiveness, and the ability for a bank owned by the people to drive an entire economy into terrific success, regardless of what is happening in the rest of the national and global economy. So we're going to be talking about that, and we're delighted that you're along to join us. Most especially delighted to have the founder of this whole initiative, Ellen Hodgson Brown. Ellen, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Walt.
Yeah. Ellen wrote a book a couple of years ago called The Web of Debt, which was a primer on how banking works around the world. Most people don't know. The assumptions that we make around banking are rather extraordinary. And when I'm going to let Ellen tell the story about this, but the sequel to this problem treatise, laying out the problem, is the Public Bank Solution, her latest book, which talks about exactly what we'll be talking about here, is how public banks solve the problem of being tied up into the web of debt. So, Ellen, you're an author. You've done 12 books now, many of them not about banking at all. Let's just give a little background about why in the world you got interested in banking when your background is in sort of diplomatic corps and in law and in health.
Well, I wrote 10 books on health. And the last book I wrote was called Forbidden Medicine, and it was a lawsuit that I participated in of a cancer healer who's actually wound up spending time in jail. Anyway, I saw in the course of that that Big Pharma controlled the whole cancer industry. Anyway, I saw the whole conspiratorial view of history unfolding, and it was clear that where they got their power, the control point,
pharmaceutical
companies themselves, or big industry in general, but particularly the Rockefeller, Morgan, that whole complex, was from banks. That they're all connected to big banks, and where banks get their power is banks actually create our money supply. They don't just recycle existing money; they actually create money. So we have delegated to banks the power to issue our money, and we have to rent it from them, and we wind up paying double at least. Say over the course of a 30-year mortgage, you wind up paying as much again in interest as you paid in principal. And so the whole system is unsustainable because you always owe more money back than was created in these initial loans. So the process by which they create money was very interesting, and that's what I wrote about in Web of Debt. But I had actually researched that as far back as the early 70s, I think, and wanted to write on it. But at that point, I was too young to write anything. So I went to law school, and then we went in the Foreign Service, which gave me a chance to write. But I didn't really have a hook until I discovered that The Wizard of Oz was actually written as a monetary allegory in the 1890s. And it was based on this first ever march on Washington by a group named Coxey's Army. Right. So they marched all the way from Ohio to Washington, D.C. to attempt to get Congress to return to this greenback system of Abraham Lincoln,
right.
where the government would actually issue the money. And that wasn't even actually original with Lincoln. That was our colonial system, where the colonies issued their own money. And then the Bank of England, well, the King of England, but prompted by the Bank of England, disallowed us to issue our own money, and we wound up revolting. But we won the war, but we did not.
Yeah.
We lost the power to create our own money.
So you're talking about a sovereign money system.
Yeah.
That's in other words the sovereign right of nations to create their own currency, to issue their own credit into the society was taken over basically by private interests throughout various stages of history. And so the Coxey's Army thing was just one such uprising of resistance against the private control of capital. So the web of debt then leads people into an understanding of how we're stuck here, right? Mm-hmm. Is that? I mean, how would you describe?
Yeah. So I first published Web of Debt in 2007 and predicted that there would be a collapse. So then people thought I was prescient, but of course I was only citing my own sources. But so then in 2008, I knew that there was one state that owned its own bank. Mm-hmm. So I was watching that state, North Dakota, and at first there were 4 states that stayed in the black, and then there were 3, and then there were 2, and then there was 1, and it was North Dakota. So I highly suspected that it had something to do with their bank. So I started writing about it, and I think I did a PowerPoint in Michigan in late 2008 and wrote a bunch of articles. And I got so much feedback. I was overwhelmed by email, and a friend said, I can't deal with all this email. And he said, well, why don't you start a Google group? And then, they'll talk to each other. Yeah. So then we did that for a couple of years, and we got some really heavy hitters in there, some really deep thinkers, and some really interesting conversation going. And after a couple of years, we felt like we knew the answer, and it was about time to get out there and do something. Mm. So that was when the Public Banking Institute was formed. And so it was precipitated in part by certainly study, but then the economic fallout from the 2008 debacle, which, you're describing that as a bank event, right? The bank-driven event? Yeah. So why did North Dakota survive that? North Dakota is the only state that owns its own bank. The model is, that they set up this bank in 1919, so it's been there a long time. Actually, you mentioned I wrote the public bank solution because we only have the one model in the whole country, and so there were different objections to that. So then I researched public banking globally and historically, and that's what this book was about. But it turned out that 40% of banks globally are publicly owned. Something you never learn this stuff in school. They don't tell you about public banks, or even that they don't tell you where money comes from. So anyway, we have a completely wrong conception of how banking works, where money comes from. So then I wrote this sequel book to go explore all those other alternatives. And so people really don't particularly care to know about this because they're tied up in their lives and they have their ways of engaging with the currency and the credit cards, and they assume that these conditions in which high interest rates are charged and other fees and so forth, that they have to put up with that. Is that intentional? We've definitely, I think in the 1890s when Coxey's Army marched, people were more savvy, understood the banking system better than people understand now. I mean, the education system was also bought out by the Morgan and Rockefeller, cartel. Yeah. So our education has been manipulated in a certain way. Our media have been manipulated in a certain way. So there is a message that has no longer gets through, which is that we the people are sovereign. We don't have to be in debt. Money is something that we can create. We actually do create it. When you go to the bank, what the bank actually does is monetize your own promise to repay. It's like a great big community currency system. Right. But the bank has made it appear that they are lending their money or lending their depositors money, neither of which is true. You are actually monetizing your own promise to repay.
So let me say that in another way, just so people get an image of what we're looking at here. Most popular thought about banking is that bankers take the money that they give to you in a loan for your car out of the vault, and that they stash all the deposits money in the vault, and then they distribute it to the extent that they have it. And actually, none of that is true, which is a huge step in understanding what the power and availability of money and credit is. I'm going to put on the screen here a graphic that describes the existing system about how money is managed and what the public compared with the public system. So let's take a look at that for just a moment. On this one side, you see how the current Wall Street or private banking cartel controls the flow of money from taxpayers, which give their money to the municipality or the state or the city. And then that money then is deposited into Wall Street banks, typically Wall Street banks, often community banks, but community banks are challenged to handle this amount of cash because they have to underwrite and collateralize the public deposits. But the Wall Street banks, then, I'm calling them Wall Street banks in a very general sort of a term, but the big banks that handle almost $4 trillion of public money, then takes that money and does what they want to do with it, basically, with the promise of saying, look, if Mr. City, State, or Miss County, whatever, you need money, you can always come to us because we've got it. Well, so what do they do with it? Well, they take our public dollars and they invest it in places and in vehicles and financial vehicles, many of which most of us don't understand, and invest in places typically outside of the area from which the money came, the taxpayer dollars. So so they get the proceeds, and then they feed back to the public a relative pittance in returns, typically. And I think that right now that rate is about 0.49% on average, maybe a little bit higher, sometimes lower. But we're not getting a great return on our money being manipulated or managed, I should say, by the Wall Street banks. But then of course, that's what we get back available to the city. Then has available to it on a loan sort of a basis what they need to invest in schools and highways and so forth and so on. So it's a circular sort of a system, but it has a diversion that goes into Wall Street. Now on the other side of the graph, we see that what it's like without the private banking interests and control, and that is from taxpayer to the city, from the city into the city bank, from which loans are made from the city-owned bank or the county or state-owned bank into the public economy by building infrastructure, by building schools, by underwriting a variety of objectives. So there's a huge difference here. Basically, public banking then. So coming back to our conversation, public banking eliminates the middleman, doesn't it? Would you describe it as would you describe it that way?
Well, or you could argue that we, the public, are the middleman and we get the money back. I mean, you still need somebody who determines credit worthiness of the borrower, et cetera. I mean, you need an agency in there or a bank. You need a bank. Okay. That's the thing. Originally, when I wrote Web of Debt, my first thought was, well, this is terrible. They're creating the money. We should be creating the money. We could do without banks or whatever. There were all these different theories out there. But actually, and then I realized, well, actually, the banking system is a good system. You need credit, and that's what banks do. They turn your credit into something you can spend in the marketplace. So that's a good function. The only thing wrong with the system is not that banks create the money, but that banks, make it official. Make your own credit, turn your credit into something that's a legal tender. What's wrong with the system is that it's privately owned and that the private profits are siphoned out, which makes it unsustainable. And they get to control where the money goes, so they can give themselves very low interest loans with which they buy up all their competitors and form these cartels, et cetera. So what we need is a system of banks like that, but where the profits go back to the people and where the people have control of where the money goes and under what conditions, et cetera.
So the public bank solution then doesn't do away with banking or put down private banking. It's just that you're not against banks,
Right.
banks.
Oh, and in the Bank of North Dakota model, which I think is an excellent model, the public bank is basically a banker's bank. So you still have all these community banks. In fact, they have more community banks or more banks per capita than any other state, because the Bank of North Dakota partners with the local banks. So what the local banks do is they're basically the front office for this system. It's kind of like agents or any
Right.
kind of staff that the government would hire. They're hiring these local banks or they're actually helping the local banks. So the local banks will determine creditworthiness of the local borrowers, and the Bank of North Dakota steps in on the good loans that they want to help with liquidity and capital. So they make it so that the local bank can make much larger loans than they would have otherwise and get around a lot of requirements that right now are limiting them from making loans to local business, local individuals, or that North Dakota did not get into the whole subprime selling off your mortgages to investors scam, because they didn't need to. They had the Bank of North Dakota to back them up in providing the capital.
So I'm going to put a time break on this. We have this will be an edit point. The clock is not running, and I know we're probably over our 15-minute notion. What I'd like to do is just continue and make this a 28-minute. Does anybody have a clock running in there on what we've got so far? And while we're stopped, any direction?
It stopped running.
Yeah.
It's like it must reset itself somehow.
Well, okay, and I don't know where we are in the cycle. Does anybody have a clock running in there?
We're about like 16 minutes in.
Yeah.
Okay, good. So of our content, not
Yes.
counting the video. So
Without
we're
the video, we're about 16 minutes in.
okay. So we're already in. Good. So we'll do another half-hour segment. We'll make this a 28-minute one.
Okay.
Let's
and then you'll make the second one half hour too.
Yeah,
Okay.
right. Now I think I ought to do a cut-in because I don't think I introduced myself. So I'm going to do a wild cut-in
Okay.
for.
Okay, that's
All right. So let me stop the recording.
Oh well, that's okay. I mean, you could let it roll. We'll just edit it out later on. Right, Rick?